Hi, Amber here. Welcome to my knitting studio. Today I have a tutorial for you for the Jolly Jumper. This is quite a long video. I go over the overview of the construction of the garment, talk about how to use yarn, and then there's several technique tutorials as well, including Judy's Magic Cast On, the Stretchy 3-needle bind off, picking up stitches. It also includes progress tables so you can keep track of where you're at, and there's also a blank schematic of the sleeveless and sleeved version so that you can play around colouring it in and see how you want to arrange colours for your project. The pattern has a number of options, including 2 lengths, hip length and cropped length, which I'm currently wearing. 2 sleeve options, short or sleeveless and long sleeve. Some of our test knitters chose to make 3/4 sleeves and they look fantastic too. It's really up to you how you want to make the most of your yarn and the project that you'll enjoy wearing. Links to the pattern and places that you can find me are linked in the description below. I designed this project with yarn advent or festive kit in mind, the kind where you open a small package each day and have a mini skein of yarn to knit into a project. With that in mind, I created a few options with the Jolly Jumper, which include short and long sleeve, striped and fade, with the idea that you can make the most of your yarny mini skein set. Or you could also knit it in a solid colour, maybe with a contrast colour for the cuffs and collar. I'll give a little overview of the construction and then talk a bit more about how to make the most of your yarn for this project. The construction begins at the centre back here and starts with a provisional cast on, or as I recommend in the pattern, Judy's Magic Cast On, which casts on live stitches over 2 sets of needles, meaning that you're able to knit in 2 directions from the cast on. Once you've cast on, and I'll demonstrate that technique later in the video, you will knit on just 1 set of needles across the back to where the neckline ends. Then you'll hold those stitches on your needle and work the stitches across the other way. And the direction of knitting will change slightly. When you cast on Judy's Magic Cast On, you'll then knit up and then purl down in this direction. On this side, it's the opposite. You'll knit down the stitches and purl up. It should make sense when you're knitting it. It's good to keep in mind though. So once you've knit both of these sections, you'll place the live stitches on holders and do the same for the front. When I talk about the right side and the left side in the pattern, it is according to how it is when it's worn. When I wear this jumper, this is the right side and this is the left side. So just be aware that the references in the pattern refer to when the jumper is being worn versus how it is when you look at it. When I look at it, this is the right side, which is actually the left side when I'm wearing it. So then we come over to the front and work the Judy's Magic Cast On in the centre, and we're going to work across the right side to the right and hold those stitches, and then repeat on the left side here and hold those stitches. There is some shaping occurring for the neckline, and then these stitches will remain held while the stitches across the right side back are picked up. Stitches are cast on for the rest of the neckline and joined with the front stitches and worked back and forth for the rest of the body. When it comes to the left side, the same process happens. Here is the underarm where it will be joined And you can see here with the striped version, there's a full 6-row stripe on each side, and then the join, which is a 3-needle bind off. The sleeve stitches are separated at this point, and then the sleeves are worked in the round down to the cuffs. And repeat all that for the left side. Or if you're making the sleeveless version, once the sleeves have been divided, you'll work ribbing here and bind off. Then you'll pick up stitches along the bottom for the bottom ribbing, work ribbing, rounds, bind off, and the same for the collar. And then you'll have a jolly jumper. So let's talk about yarn. I included a lot of information in the yardage table for this pattern to help you make the most of the yarn you'd like to use for this project. There's the total yardage for just the cuffs and collars, that's the contrast colour, and the total yardage for the main body with and without sleeves, and that's the main colour. In the fade version, that's helpful to work out the overall yardage and figure out how to arrange your fade within that. With the striped version, yardages have also been given for each stripe. So there's a yardage amount for a full front and back body stripe, and also for the widest part of the sleeves. The idea being that you'll be able to go through your stash or look at your festive kit and figure out the best way to arrange colours for your project. A 24 colour festive kit at 20 grams per colour is approximately 960 yards, so it's not enough for a full body for most sizes. So I figured that adding more contrast colour and incorporating stripes would help the festive kit go further. So adding the 6 colour stripes. Here I stashed dough for this project, so I wasn't incorporating a festive kit. I did, however, incorporate this contrast colour into the stripes to stretch the stripes out a little further. I did incorporate this contrast colour into the stripe pattern to help pad out the stripe yardage of the yarns. Also, it ties it in together nicely, I think. And the same with the short sleeve version, where I used a colour changing yarn. I haven't used mini skeins for this project. With this project, I ordered a 10 colour fade set, and I ordered 2, so it was equivalent of 20 gram mini skeins, and I knew that that would be enough for this size. And I also knew that I wanted to create a mirrored fade, so I worked the set the same on both sides. I just kept track of how many rows I did for each colour and repeated the same on the other side. So you would work half of each mini across one half and half across the other. Of course, you would need to take into account the total yardage required for your size and option that you've chosen. You might need to make a few calculations, and that's why I've provided as much information as I can on the yardages tables. Whether you use a festive yarn kit or not, this pattern provides a blank canvas for you to go for it and be creative. Perhaps stash dive and use up all those bits of colour and create something wild or something a little more subtle. We'll start our jolly jumper with its cast on, which is Judy's Magic cast on technique. It's fantastic for a provisional cast on option. Start by taking both ends of my yarn cake and just loosely tying them together This will become undone and woven into the project later on. And I'm going to hold one thread with my forefinger and one with my thumb. Then I'll take, holding the needles parallel, top needle, bottom needle. I'll slide the top needle in behind that top thread, yarn, and keep the bottom one as is. As we work this cast on, the yarn here at the top will actually be cast onto the bottom needle, and the yarn here at the bottom will be cast onto the top needle. This will count as one stitch. So now I take the top yarn, bring it under and over and between for a stitch to be cast onto that bottom needle. Just hold those firmly at first. Now we take the bottom yarn and bring it up over the top needle and in between and back under. So now we have 2 stitches on the top needle. And repeat for the bottom, just keep that yarn out of the way. 2 stitches on each needle. So now it's the top. Bring the yarn behind, over and in between for a top stitch. Bring that top yarn under, over and in between for a bottom stitch. And then it gets quite rhythmic once you get into the flow of it. I find having a little a counter thing here handy for counting. So you just count across one needle, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then the way I count as I go along is 8, 8, 8, 9, 9, 10, 10. And that would be 10 stitches. Continue until you've cast on the number required for your size. It will say stitches for each needle, so make sure you cast on the correct number for each needle. I'll just cast on another 10 here, so I can knit and show you how it's worked after that. $15, 16, 17, 19, 20. Okay, so they're cast on. The top needle is going to be turned around and become the bottom needle. I'm going to use this yarn to work the first row of stitches with and break an end here, but be sure to secure that with my hand as I'm working those stitches. So the pattern instruction is to knit across the stitches on one needle. So just holding that yarn there in place, just knit across those stitches. So I managed to knit onto the wrong set of needles, which is fine. I'll just grab that other set and knit back across for the next row. I'll just purl across as instructed in the pattern. Okay, so back on both sets of needles. And this is the working side with the working yarn. It may pay at this point to either place that second set of stitches on some scrap yarn or put some needle stoppers on the end. Whatever you might like to use is little screw ones, or you might use something like this, and that will help you see which is the stitches you're working, and just keep those from falling off. So we've cast on 2 sets of stitches here, knit 1 row and purl 1 row, and that's equivalent to a 4-row stripe at this point. So I will continue with this colour for another 2 rows. I'll knit across and purl, and then at that point I would change colours for my next 6-row stripe. Okay, I finished those 2 rows and now have my 6-row stripe. So I'll incorporate the next colour, or just continue if knitting a fade or solid colour version. And I'll add that in, and I'll carry yarn as I go for the 6-row stripes. So just knitting across those stitches and purling back. Once I've worked the required number of rows and or stripes for the right side, there would be a few more than this, it's time to work across the left side. So I'll hold these stitches with either stoppers, holders, scrap yarn. I'll use a stopper. So to remind you, the direction of knitting for this side is knit, purl. On this side, which is the neckline here, it will be knitting down and purling up, just slightly different. So you start with the right side facing. That will help you determine that. Put that net back on the needle. Bring that needle in, and we're just going to knit across those stitches. However, for the first row, we will be knitting into the back of the loop, and we will take this knot off as well. So we'll knit through the back of the loop because the stitches are slightly twisted on this side of the cast on. And that will help them realign. Knit all the way to the end. Once you've reached the end, turn your work and purl back across and continue to work as per the pattern. And here's the beginnings of the jolly jumper. This was the cast on, which also became the first 2 rows of the right side first stripe, or the first 2 rows of the right side, working up and purling, knitting up and purling back down, knit the number of rows required, come back over here and knit down for the left side, working in the opposite direction. Stitches are held once you've completed both sides, and you'll cast on for the front. Once you've finished the fronts and backs and the underarm rows, we'll work a stretchy 3-needle bind off to join the fronts and backs together under the arm here. And it looks like this on the inside, a neat little seam created with the stretchy 3-needle bind off. I've got this little swatch here to demonstrate the technique for you. And instead of having the sleeve, I'm just folding it over on itself. So this is equivalent to the 2 live rows of stitches that you'll find on the inside of the garment, because you'll be working this with the right sides of the fabric facing in and working with your garment inside out for that seam. There'll be an even number of stitches on each needle from working the underarm seams, and then you'll need a third needle for the 3 needle bind off. And it's pretty straightforward. You'll start by joining yarn. The first step of this will be taking that third needle, holding the 2 sets of stitches parallel, and insert the needle through the first stitch as if to knit and the second stitch as if to knit. Wrap your working yarn around and pull it through both of those stitches and slide it over to your third needle, your right needle, and you have 1 stitch where you had 2. Repeat this a second time. Pull that yarn through. And you now have 2 stitches on that needle. And this is where we're going to do the stretchy bind off part. We will insert this front needle through the 2 stitches, through the front of those 2 stitches, wrap the yarn around and knit those stitches together. So where there were 2 stitches, now there's 1 stitch cast off in the stretchy bind off. And there's still 1 stitch on that right needle. And we'll keep repeating those steps. So knit 2 stitches together from the left needle, insert through the 2 stitches on the right needle and knit those 2 together for a stretchy bind off second stitch. And you'll keep repeating that until all the stitches have been bound off. You will end up with a final stitch that you'll just pull the yarn through at the end. Down to the last stitches. Repeat those steps again. And for the final stitch, there we go. Pull the working yarn, break the yarn and pull that through the loop. And there you have a stretchy 3 needle bind off that provides a nice seam for your jolly jumper. Okay, so I have my funny little sample here and want to demonstrate picking up stitches for the ribbing edge. Your project will be in the round at this point. I just bound off that edge for the swatch. The pattern says pick up 4 stitches for every 6 rows, which is quite handy with the 6-row stripes. Here, because I've got this bound off edge, I've got kind of an extra row in there. So I'll pick up 5 stitches along here. So start with that kind of edge there. The aim is to pick them up in a straight line so that it's nice and neat. And to pick them up, poke the needle through the stitch with both of the legs of the stitch going through the needle, or the needle going through both of the legs, and knit a stitch. So that's pick up and knit a stitch. A second, keeping that line nice and neat. Then I'll skip a stitch. Or skip a row and work the next 2. So I have 5 here, 1 just to kind of account for that extra bind off edge, and continue along the next colour. So I might skip into the next, skip one row, go to the next. 1, 2, skip 1, 1, 2. So that's 4 stitches into those 6 rows, and continue on like that. I'll skip that first row again. And continue along that line. When you weave in the ends, you'll tighten up some of those colour change looser bits. Because this is worked in the round, you'll go all the way around to the start of the round and then just join to work in the round and start knitting the ribbing. The collar, slightly different with the increases along here. Just be sure to continue to pick up at the same ratio, keeping a nice even line as you do. And you'll be picking up along the cast on edge here too. When it comes to binding off, you can use a regular bind off. I've just used a standard bind off here, keeping it loose-ish, not too loose, so that it's nice and stretchy. I also offer the option of a tubular bind off in the pattern, which just adds that bit neater edge. I think it's particularly nice around the collar to work the tubular bind off, just for a neater finish there. In this sample, I worked the tubular for all of them, but I also worked the regular for the hem on this one and the arms, and then tubular bind off for the neck. Yeah, you can mix and match the bind offs to what suits you. I've knit a little bit of twisted ribbing on my trusty swatch here, which I'm working flat. Your project will be in the round, but it's still effective for the tubular bind off tutorial. You'll need a working yarn of approximately 3 times the length of the area to bind off, which will be quite long for the hem, shorter for the sleeves. And thread that onto a tapestry needle. So it's quite repetitive. There are 4 steps, although you'll start off with one setup step first. The setup step is to insert the needle through the first stitch as if to knit, and because we've been knitting twisted ribbing through the back loop, insert the needle through the back loop and just take that stitch off the needle. Now the first of the 4 steps. The next stitch is a purl stitch, and noting that when you're working this ribbing will help you remember to see where you're up to. So when you see a purl stitch here, you'll purl or insert the tapestry needle as if to purl in the stitch next to it, that knit stitch there, right into the front, and pull that yarn through. Then come back to the purl stitch, insert purlwise and pull off the needle. And that's 2 stitches bound off there. Next we have a knit stitch, and this will be worked a bit differently. The setup, or the first part of this, is bringing the needle behind the work through the front, then through that purl stitch and back through to the back. And then you're going to insert the needle through the back loop as if to knit through the back loop and pull that stitch off. So that's the 4 steps. I'll show you again. Purlwise through the second stitch and pull the thread through. Then come back and purl, take it off the needle, that first stitch. Next, bring your needle through the center of the next 2 stitches and push it through the center of that purl stitch, pull to the back, insert the needle in the first stitch as if to knit through the back loop, and take that stitch off the needle. 4 steps. So I know that when I see the purl bump, I'm up to the purl step, which is purl, purl, and then the next stitch is the knit. Insert through the center of the next 2 stitches. Once you've bound a few stitches off, you'll get into the flow of this. It is a little bit more time consuming, but it's a nice finish and worth it. It's a bit tricky to undo though, so make sure you're nice and focused while you're working this and keep track of where you're up to. And continue on until the last 2 stitches. And just pull the yarn through the final stitch. Take that off the needle. And there you are. Nice, neat finish for your ribbing. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial and are inspired to make your own jolly jumper. Links to the pattern and places you can find me online are in the description below.